So Bud, thanks for this. We're going to try to replay these, and it's part of our messaging out to others about people who experience and backgrounds such as yourself, who we think the public needs to hear more from. And the fact that you're a member of our board of advisors makes it particularly interesting for us. And so we prepared a number of questions, which you can go in any direction you wish on these questions. But let's start right away, and we'll get into. I wanted to ask you about the role of Congress, which has been getting a lot of criticism these days in terms of its dysfunctionality and so on. But what do you think should be the proper role of Congress in the conduct of American foreign policy? And what do you think can be done to improve the performance of Congress in terms of getting them to do more fact-based, solutions-oriented, collaborative foreign policy making for the good of the country?
Well, I think the Congress is obviously closer to the people than the presidency. The presidency is limited for force as one institution and the amount of time it can get to and devote to covering grassroots. The Congress, the House in particular, is much closer to the population and is receptive, sensitive to what's on their minds. And separately, of course, the Congress must appropriate funds for any activity overseas and at home. So the Congress has the authority, the mandate to appropriate the funds for the support of foreign affairs. And that's not only wars, but foreign aid, the State Department, CIA, and so forth. So Congress has a very vital role, and the president can do a lot toward advancing his own ideas by listening to the Congress. And that can take many forms. President Reagan used to meet with the bipartisan leadership every Tuesday morning, and occasionally would meet with a single party's leadership. But he'd also spend time after those Tuesday meetings, phone calls, late afternoon get-together, one-on-ones with the leadership. And of course, during times of crisis, as for example, before the Grenada invasion in '83, the president really is obligated, and even if he weren't, sensible to call the Congress leadership down and to go over with them what's the motivation here, what are the risks, what are the costs, are there going to be allies involved, and in short, to make the Congress what it is, a full co-equal branch and a partner that underwrites American foreign policy, literally and financially, and that helps among allies too. I recall in the run-up to the first summit with the Soviet Union in '85 with Gorbachev, and the president made a particular point of spending a lot of time with the Congress to explain what he wanted to do. And as a consequence, when we got to Geneva, and we had disagreements, as was inevitable, particularly over what was known as Star Wars, at the end of the day, the intellectual argument went on for some time, but at the end of the day, President Gorbachev had to look hard at what was the source of power of President Reagan, and at the time, it had a joint resolution from the Congress before he left, strongly supporting on a bipartisan basis what he intended to set as his goals. And of course, the polling domestically had a very high approval rating from him. And finally, the third essential constituency, which is allies, had gotten together under Prime Minister Thatcher's leadership. And Gorbachev had to realize, as his foreign minister, Shevardnadze, later told me, that he was looking across the table at the strongest leader in the world. But an important measure of that was congressional support. It was very vivid.
Okay. Do you have any suggestions about how the Congress role can be amplified, can be improved upon what we're seeing today?
Well, I think before the president has something that he wants to launch as a new idea, he's always wise, or she, to reaching out and listening and calling down the chair and the ranking minority members of committees that are relevant, that have oversight of the new area, the domain in which he wants to change tax policy or education or healthcare, and tell them, here are the outlines of what I think makes sense for our country, but then to invite comment, criticism, and to essentially give a little, perhaps alter what he had intended to propose to give it a better chance of appealing to a bipartisan consensus in the chambers of the House and Senate. So quite a lot of success working with the Congress depends on listening, and you often get very good ideas.
Right. Well, thank you for that. It's very, very interesting. Let me just shift to another broad question that we'd like you to think about. As you think about the world today and the various issues that the United States and others have to confront, what do you think are the most pressing global challenges that we have to face over the next half decade, let's say, or more for that matter? And how equipped are U.S. policy makers and institutions to deal with those challenges?
Well, there are a number of challenges that have arisen in the past 10 years. Currently, I'd have to say that our vulnerability to cyberattack that could take many forms. Most of our infrastructure is very vulnerable to attack by electronic means. And I have in mind the vulnerability of our financial services community, banks, to being hacked by cyber attack, and the privacy of individuals as well as the functioning of your bank being compromised and causing chaos. As you can imagine, the degree to which we all rely on credit, not just for daily shopping and retail, but for refinancing homes. And so a breakdown in that system could be catastrophic for our country. But beyond that, any other system that relies importantly on the internet, power generation, the control of water, even traffic signals, things like that. So from the mundane to the mega industrial and governmental functions rely upon security. And it's very vulnerable because almost all of these systems rely on the internet. One can go so far in securing them through encryption and other protective devices, but we find every day that hackers find new ways to launch their attacks. So I'd put cyber right at the top of the list. But beyond that, I'd go quickly to radical Islam and the vulnerability of our society to this exclusive, small, yet well-armed, well-trained, well-financed group of individuals in the Muslim world that deny the legitimacy of any other faith, even the legitimacy of other Muslim interpretations of Islam, and have committed themselves, as we know from ISIS in Iraq and Syria, to governing first in Syria and Iraq, but ultimately expanding to establish a functioning state and to grow it after expelling Western influence from the Middle East, to establish a global caliphate, kingdom. This is a very, again, well-armed and well-trained and well-financed group. We simply have to try to call upon moderate Muslims, and primarily in the countries of Sunni Islam in Saudi Arabia and Jordan, the Gulf Cooperation Council, Egypt, but also other countries in the Middle East, including Israel, to begin to share intelligence on these terrorists and quite brutal savages, really, to build the training of local forces in neighboring countries to go after these very determined fanatics. I'd put that very high on our list. And indeed, it's not just the Middle East. You find Muslim minorities in the Philippines and Thailand and throughout North Africa and East Africa. So it's a serious problem. We're going to face it for the next generation or more. Finally, though, and this one may seem a little surprising given the windfall blessing of fracking and shale oil and gas development, energy is going to become a problem again in the not too distant future. And I say that because the bulk of energy, primarily oil, more than 75% of all the oil in the earth is owned by a cartel. And a cartel ultimately can set the price of any commodity. Today, the OPEC Cartel hadn't anticipated that we'd have this phenomenal growth in oil production in the United States. And because it was unexpected, that run-up in American production provided more supply, and so the price was driven down. However, when the cartel owns more than 75%, demand from China primarily, but also India and emerging markets in Asia and Africa, will outstrip supply from the United States alone. And by controlling what they produce, OPEC can allow that price to rise again, and it will. So we're enjoying a temporary benefit. What we must do is to introduce alternative fuels that we can use in transportation. The good news is that there are alternatives, and we're seeing it each day from electricity and Elon Musk's vehicles and other manufacturers, but also alternative liquid fuels that don't rely on petroleum. And these include methanol, ethanol, biodiesel, a lot of ways you can power a light vehicle. We simply have to enable our free market to introduce these alternatives, and that'll drive the price down and demonstrate to OPEC that ultimately they're going to have to compete on a level playing field so as to keep the price that is affordable for people not only here at home in the United States, but in developing countries and in China, India.
I found it interesting that the OPEC cartel did not cut production during the surge of energy production here in the United States, oil and natural gas. Why do you think that's the case? Because if they have that power to manage supply, which impacts on price, of course, they opted to continue to produce at regular, predictable levels, when in fact they could have reduced production. Is there any explanation what the motive behind that was? The Saudis particularly.
Well, it's a very good question, and you're right. Saudi Arabia, within the OPEC cartel, because it's the largest producer, will drive decision-making and decide when to produce less or more. But your question is a very good one. I believe there are two reasons why they didn't cut production to drive up the price. When you're in Saudi Arabia and you look around the country's neighborhood, you see Iran across the Persian Gulf, a rival for dominance in the Islam world, and Iran needs about $140 a barrel to be the global price for them to be able to balance their budget and afford the subsidies and other expenditures that they have. Well, with oil down at around $60 or even less, that hurts Iran a lot. Consequently, I think that was a driving motive for Saudi Arabia not to allow OPEC to vote to cut production. But I think also the other worrisome element when Saudi Arabia looks around its neighborhood is ISIS, radical Islam, that has publicly declared its wish to topple the royal family. They call it frequently an illegitimate regime, and they call upon the turning out of not only Saudi Arabia's royal family, but other monarchies within the Persian Gulf, from Kuwait to Bahrain to Oman and so forth. And so when Saudi Arabia asks itself, what do we do about that? They can rally together with other Gulf Arab states, but to really take down and destroy this phenomena, it takes the United States. And so low prices are welcome in the United States, as they are anywhere. And so keeping them low gives them a better probability of getting American cooperation. But it's those factors, I think, that have led them to be relatively relaxed about keeping the price low. Now, bear in mind that Saudi Arabia has the ability to tolerate low prices for a long time. They have about $750 billion in the bank in hard currencies and in liquid instruments, another several trillion dollars, and so they could hold out with low prices for a very long time.
Very interesting. Thank you for that. Speaking of energy, which I know you've spent years thinking about, you've been and this really continues with this previous response, you've been an outspoken advocate of reducing U.S. dependence on foreign oil and creating competition, competitive fuel markets to strengthen energy security. But the new development that you were just referring to with the collapse of the price of oil and the glut of supplies really around the world creates a whole new dynamic, and you were alluding to that. There are those in the Congress and elsewhere who don't see this as the pressing issue that it was years ago when the prices were constantly escalating and there was attempt to control supplies and therefore impact on prices. So in light of these new realities, what are some of the key national security objectives or goals or arguments on behalf of this pursuit of national independence on foreign oil?
Well, I believe that when you or I conduct our daily lives and plan for the survival of our families and ultimate prosperity, we hope, prices are important. And we learn over time that when you shop, whether it's for a suit of clothes or shoes or a car or whatever, that choices keep the price lower. So it's a good news when there are 3 major automobile manufacturers or a dozen for telephones or everything that you and I may need for our kids and grandkids to get by is kept at a low price because of competition. Well, that's true, especially of transportation fuel. More competition means lower prices. And so, while it's a blessing that we have had this windfall discovery through technology and development to have higher production of oil. But still, however, if the price is controlled by a cartel, that price is going to be exorbitant and unaffordable if 75% of it is owned by one cabal. And so introducing competition is the only way you'll bring down a cartel. That's important. That said, of course, a cartel also wants to avoid the collapse of the global market, and so it is likely that they will keep it within bounds that doesn't kill the goose that's laying the golden egg, so to speak. However, to moderate the price of oil, competition's the only way you're going to do it. And the good news is there are many alternatives: electricity, biodiesel, methanol, ethanol, someday fuel cells. So we're in a good position for energy security, but only if we insist on an open, competitive marketplace.
It's interesting. I wasn't going to ask you this question, but I think you catalyzed another question in my mind about nuclear energy. I know that the United States has more nuclear power reactors than any other country. I think there's 104 nuclear reactors in the United States. We depend on our electricity of, I think, between 15 and 19% of our electricity comes from nuclear power. Other countries, France gets about 70% from nuclear energy, that sort of thing. And it looks like if one were to project into the future, that this is going to be a growth industry, with all the caveats and worries and concerns about accidents and safety and that sort of thing, and the cost. Do you have a view in this area of competition for energy supplies where nuclear fits in?
Well, I think nuclear power has to be an important part of power generation in the years ahead. And I say that because ultimately it is the cheapest and environmentally cleanest. And the good news is that in the last 25 years, there have been dramatic gains in safety and in efficiency and affordability. So I think that with all the discoveries being made from modular nuclear power units to what to do with spent fuel, the solutions are there now to the problems that have vexed us from Chernobyl to 3 Mile Island. Nuclear power does have to make its case. I think it is doing a better job at doing that. But also, since we know and we can have demonstrated the safety as well as how to handle the entire fuel cycle to dispose of spent fuel, it's important that we look hard at how do you induce investors to take the risk, because historically, the regulatory oversight of getting a permit to build a nuclear power plant has been so expensive and take for so long that the last plant that we built, I think 30 years ago, Comanche Peak, took about 9 years. And the cost of that was not the capital cost of building the reactor. It was the lawyers and bankers spending time in 5-star hotels and flying back and forth that ran up the cost of building that plant. And that was because of the regulatory burden. Now, safety is important. And so we have to have safety requirements that can be demonstrated, and they can very easily, but also to streamline decision-making. And right now, that's vexing us beyond nuclear power into oil and gas. Can we export them or not when other countries are needy? So we have to look hard at energy policy across the board, but importantly, as you point out, nuclear power ought to have a future, as you say, 85% in France, about the same or more in Japan. It's safe, it can be done, that's demonstrable, we have to get on with it.
staying in the region, we were talking before about the Saudis, and staying in the Persian Gulf area, you've on a number of occasions talked about the strategic relationships with our regional allies in the context of establishing a credible deterrent in the region, and talked about a Middle East regional security organization of some sort that might be necessary given the volatility and the dangers in the region and security interests that we have. What regional relationships do you see or foresee as having the most impact in furthering that kind of goal in the region?
Well, I think that our focus on Iran has awakened us to the tension between Sunni Islam, which is about 85% of Islam, and Shia. Shia community is dominated by Iran, 90 million people, right across the Gulf from the leading Sunni population in Saudi Arabia as well as the Gulf Arab states. Well, the moderate Gulf Arab states have already developed a collective security organization called the Gulf Cooperation Council. From Kuwait in the north, Saudi, and going on down to Bahrain, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and Oman, that is a functioning planning body. I think the United States would do well to pay attention to how we can be helpful to it, not to dominate it. It has its own decision-making system, but it doesn't have inherently the strength in numbers, in weapon systems, or in a history of strategic planning and the intelligence to know day to day, as well as what's over the horizon, what is coming at them. And so to begin to engage and listen to the GCC countries, to offer to be helpful, whether it's intelligence sharing, periodic exercises, and to nurture over time a relationship of mutual respect and trust so that deterrence becomes real. Deterrence of any adversary, that is, whether it's radical Islam or sectarian challengers such as Iran. I'd also, however, broaden beyond the Gulf to include Jordan and Egypt, and over time, others as may wish to participate out of their own self-interest. I'd also not pass up Israel. Israel, for obvious reasons, has lived in the neighborhood for 70 years, actually about 2,000 years, and has a very good sense of trends, threats, and its intelligence system is the best in the Middle East, certainly. There are ways that Israel could cooperate with the regional parties, moderate Arab states, in projects of mutual benefit. For example, Saudi Arabia today is exporting most of its oil through the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, where it does face a threat from a possible interference by Iran. If Saudi Arabia were able to export its oil on the west side of the country through the Red Sea, possibly up through a passage other than the Suez Canal, and Israel could guarantee the security of such a pipeline and give Saudi Arabia options. Well, there are a dozen other kinds of ways in which we could begin to enable the parties, Israel and the Gulf moderate Arabs, to talk to each other, to gain some confidence of the benign intention on both sides, and ultimately to work our way toward a political agenda that involves reduced tensions and broadening the peace that exists between Israel, Jordan, and Egypt to other regional parties. I think that can be done. It ought to be part of the agenda for any president from now on.
How formal of arrangement would you think this would have to be effective?
Well, I don't think it could be formal in the early years, and it would take 5 to 10 years, even more, before formal relationships and treaties would become feasible for the Gulf Arab states and for Saudi Arabia. And beyond that, there is resistance historically to any kind of formal dialogue with Israel. So it'll take time, but it's already happening clandestinely because they see it's in their mutual interest. So it doesn't have to be formal, but the proof is if there are exchanges that benefit both sides and peace is maintained and deterrence is real, there'll be an incentive to press on toward a more formal arrangement.
And you see the United States playing the sort of the role of trying to make this happen.
Well, I do. In modern history, it's been the United States since World War II that has provided the strategic wherewithal to keep the peace. It is the United States Navy that enables global trade to occur peacefully throughout the world, to make sure that choke points from Hormuz to Bab el-Mandeb to Malacca are secure and that trade flows predictably, that insurance rates stay low, and that everyone benefits from that. Similarly, in deterring sources of violence and tension, whether it's radical Islam or the threat of a nuclear state emerging that might kick off an arms race, it has to be the United States that is the only one that has the power, the leverage, the allies to bring together a combination of political, economic, and military power to influence any opposing party to behave. So I think we've had some setbacks in recent years, that we've made judgments that have alarmed in the Middle East, the moderate Arab states. But it isn't to say that we can't rebuild those relationships, and I believe that given the trends that we're experiencing right now, we need to do that, to see the value in maintaining strong relationships with modern Muslim countries, to nurture those allies and not allow competitors from Russia to Iran to weaken them. It's going to take time, though, and I believe it can be done.
I know that President Obama is having this Arab summit, I guess he calls it, at Camp David in about 2 weeks, which they're going to discuss these very same kinds of issues, give reassurances to the countries in the Persian Gulf and the larger region that the United States basically has their back, if you want to put it that way. And so maybe this would be the kernel of the discussion, moving in the kind of direction that you're just articulated. We'll see what happens at that point in time. I know they're going to talk about military sales and other kinds of security arrangements in the region that would give some kind of degree of confidence depending on what happens with Iran and the nuclear issue. Yeah. I should be asking you those questions, not articulating them.
No, you make a very good point there. I think it's an excellent initiative. Yeah. And I think there will be some calls from the Gulf Arab states for what do you believe, what gives you confidence about Iran and the nuclear proposition? Why shouldn't we get our own nuclear weapons? Is the United States going to be there for us? So this kind of open dialogue is very healthy and will stimulate some ideas that I think will be taken to heart on both sides. But it's a good idea. I think it's the right kind of thing for America to do.
One final question, just on the question of U.S. influence and its durability over time. And what do you think is the the most important thing the United States can do in order to maintain the kind of influence, the positive influence that we have in the world today, to shape the kinds of events, such as in the Middle East that you just articulated, that would help us to ensure not only our security and our prosperity, but those of our friends and allies, not just in the Middle East, but around the world.
Well, ultimately, for the United States to deserve and to execute effective leadership of global politics, it has to elaborate sound policies that deal with the leading threats to global security, and that's both political and economic security. Well, the best way to do that is to be a better listener and make sure that you engage allies, discuss the range of options that you think make sense for deterring conflict as well as stimulating economic growth, and to hear what their concerns are, and then for an administration to elaborate policies that are consistent with those needs and sense of threat. It can be done. In the late 1970s, we went through a time when our economy was facing double-digit inflation, unemployment, so forth, and people were beginning to worry about whether or not the United States could solve its own problems, let alone be a good ally. President Reagan was elected and recognized that the first thing we had to do was get our own house in order. And I think that's going to be true for the next few years here. We have some serious problems of debt in our country. We have shrill disagreements about health care, housing, education, law enforcement, racial relations. So I think right now and through the next election, it's going to be important that a president, our president, focus on getting America in a more unified, stable situation, not just politically, but economically, and then begin to listen hard to what is the view of our principal allies in Asia as well as Europe and the Middle East concerning the threats they face. Yes, military threats, but also economic threats. And once you've digested that sense of risk overseas, to elaborate policies that will succeed in deterring conflict, first of all, but then are also establishing a climate that will provide for economic growth and a global trading system that benefits all parties. This isn't really rocket science. It can be done, but it takes care, and you have to have good people involved. The president can't do this by himself or herself. I'm optimistic. Our country's always been able to renew itself when it's faced periods of unrest and decline, and I'm confident we can do it again.
Okay. One final question, a spin-off of this one, is that given the economics and financial underpinnings of security, do you have a view on the TTP, the Trans-Pacific Trade, and the advantages that would have for the United States, or disadvantages for that matter, if in fact the president is given fast-track authority on TTP? What are your thoughts about that prospects? Do you see that as a positive or any other way?
I'm a believer that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is good for the United States, and I say that intending for everyone, for labor, for business, industry. Ultimately, free trade provides for lower prices for consumers, and while there is an impact on labor, you can mitigate that if at the same time, here at home, we stimulate and maintain innovation. The United States has always been able to figure out the next big thing. because we have freedom in our universities and in industry, as you know, we have come up with the internet, with cures for various diseases, with ways to stimulate growth in chemical industry, in medicine, in defense. But the point is, keep doing that. And that's the blessing of this free, independent society that our forebears created here 250 years ago. So I'm not gloomy about our future. I'm very optimistic and looking forward to it.